When people think about medieval warfare, they usually picture armored knights on horseback. But a lot of the fear on real battlefields came from other warriors. Raiders who struck without warning, infantry who could stop a charge cold, and missile troops who could change a fight before anyone even got close. This list focuses on 10 of the most feared medieval fighters in and around Europe who weren't knights, and what actually made them so dangerous. Their tactics, their training, their weapons, and the kind of wars they were built for. Number 1. Viking raiders. People in early medieval Europe feared Vikings less because they were better fighters, and more because they showed up in the worst possible way. Fast, unexpected, and usually where nobody was ready. Longships could cross open sea, then slip into shallow rivers and hit towns far inland. That meant coastlines and river networks felt exposed all the time. A lot of local forces were small, slow to gather, and tied to farming seasons, so a sudden raid could be over before a serious defense formed. In actual combat, many Vikings fought like other European warriors of the time. Spear and shield were common, axes were popular, and swords were expensive status weapons. Armor varied a lot. Wealthier fighters might wear mail, interlinked iron rings, and a solid helmet, while others relied on a thick, padded jacket. What made them feel terrifying was the pattern. Repeated strikes, quick withdrawals, and the fact that monasteries, ports, and market towns were prime targets because they had wealth and weaker walls. When Vikings did fight set battles, they could form shield walls, basically overlapping shields to create a moving barrier, so they weren't just chaotic raiders. Stories about berserkers, the supposed wild trance fighters, helped build the legend, but the real fear came from logistics. Ships, speed, surprise, and the ability to choose fights on their terms. And while Viking-style raiding shook Western Europe, an even bigger shock hit the east and center of the continent when a totally different kind of army arrived. One built around horses, distance, and non-stop movement. Number 2. Mongol horse archers. When Mongol forces entered Europe in the 1200s, many Europeans had never faced an army that could move that fast, coordinate across huge distances, and still hit hard. The classic Mongol advantage was the horse archer, a rider trained to shoot accurately at speed using a composite bow, made from layers like wood, horn, and sinew. It was compact, powerful, and perfect for mounted warfare. But the bow was only one piece of it. Mongol armies used tight organization, reliable messengers, scouts, and disciplined units that could split up, gather information, and regroup quickly. They also used tactics that felt confusing and scary to opponents, like feigned retreats, where a unit pulls back to tempt pursuit, then turns the chase into an ambush. In 1241, European forces suffered major defeats at battles like Legnica in today's Poland and Mohi in Hungary, which helps lock in the reputation that resisting them in open ground was a gamble. Europeans were used to armies that depended heavily on armored cavalry charges and close combat. Mongols often refused to give them that kind of fight until the moment was right. Their withdrawal from much of Central Europe in 1242 is often linked to leadership and succession issues back in the empire, but the impression stayed. This was an enemy that could appear, outmaneuver, and vanish before you could react. In a different corner of the medieval world, there was also a famous group of foreigners that rulers trusted for exactly the opposite reason. Not for disappearing, but for standing their ground and staying loyal in the middle of chaos. Number 3. Varangian Guard. In Byzantium, The emperor's personal protection wasn't just ceremonial.
The Varangian Guard had a reputation as hard, disciplined professionals, and that made them feared on battlefields and respected in the palace. The unit became well known from the late 900s onward, with many recruits coming from the north, Scandinavians, Rus, and later a lot of Anglo-Saxons who left England after the Norman conquest. In simple terms, they were elite heavy infantry, men who could hold a line, guard key points, and hit with serious force when ordered forward. Their signature weapon, in a lot of descriptions, is the big two-handed axe, which is part practical and part psychological. An axe like that can damage shields, hook, and create openings, and it looks intimidating even before it's used. Many would also carry swords and spears, and they wore strong armor for the time, often mail with helmets, because they were paid and equipped better than typical levies. What really mattered was reliability. A medieval ruler worried constantly about betrayal, and foreigners with pay, status, and a direct bond to the emperor were seen as less likely to get pulled into local politics. On campaign, the guard could act as a tough center for the army or as a final reserve to stabilize a fight. If you were an enemy soldier and you saw a disciplined block of heavy infantry that didn't panic when lines started to bend, that alone could drain morale. Western Europe had its own version of that idea too. Household troops who were trained, well-armed, and expected to die in place rather than break formation. Number 4. Anglo-Saxon Huscarls. Before 1066, England's kings and top nobles relied on Huscarls, professional household warriors who were very different from part-time militia. These weren't knights in the later medieval sense. They were elite infantry, paid and tied to a lord, with training and equipment that most local fighters didn't have.
Their most famous weapon is the Danish axe, a long-handled axe that could deliver heavy blows and threaten even armored opponents, especially if it found gaps or smashed shields. Huscarls also used swords and spears, and they typically fought with sturdy round shields. Many had mail shirts and good helmets, which made them unusually well protected for infantry in that period. Tactically, the key point is discipline. Huscarls fought well in the shield wall, a tight formation that rewarded steadiness, teamwork, and stamina. In the battles of 1066, Stamford Bridge, and Hastings, Huscarls became famous for how long they could hold against intense pressure. They weren't unstoppable, but they were the kind of troops commanders trusted to anchor a line or defend a critical ridge. That's why they were feared. If you ran into Huscarls, you were dealing with trained fighters who wouldn't scatter just because the first clash went badly. As medieval warfare evolved, fear started shifting from who is toughest up close to who can hurt you before you ever get close. And that's where professional missile troops, especially crossbow specialists, made their name. Number 5. Genoese crossbowmen. The crossbow changed the feeling of medieval combat because it lowered the skill barrier compared to many other ranged weapons. You still needed training, but you didn't need a lifetime of practice to draw and shoot it effectively. A crossbow stores energy mechanically, so it can deliver a powerful bolt that can punch into armor at the right range and angle. Genoa became famous for producing and hiring out professional crossbowmen, and these troops served across the Mediterranean and Western Europe as respected mercenaries. Their setup often included a pavis, an oversized shield that could be planted in the ground so the shooter had cover while reloading.
Reloading mattered because a strong crossbow can be slow. You might use a belt hook, a lever, or a windlass, a cranking device, depending on the draw weight. In battle, that meant disciplined teams and good positioning were crucial. When it worked, it was brutal in a clean, mechanical way. Steady volleys, protected shooters,
and bolts that could threaten even well-equipped men. When it didn't work, it could go wrong fast, like at Cressy in 1346, where conditions and coordination problems helped the English side. That's an important point. These feared units weren't magic. They were dangerous when their system, shields, spacing, support troops, and timing, was actually in place. Still, the reputation stuck because a well-run crossbow line forced enemies to rethink movement, especially in sieges and street fighting. And in Western Europe, one other kind of ranged warrior became even more famous for turning battles into long, exhausting tests of nerve: massed longbowmen. Number 6. English and Welsh longbowmen. The longbow was feared because it combined range, rate of fire, and volume. It wasn't a gimmick weapon. It was a system built on training and social structure. Drawing a powerful war bow takes serious strength and technique, and medieval English armies leaned heavily on archers who practiced for years. Many longbows were made from yew and stood roughly the height of the archer, giving a long draw length and strong shot. Unlike crossbows, longbows could be fired quickly, meaning an organized group could put a lot of arrows into the air in a short time. That volume mattered as much as raw penetration. People often argue about whether arrows could go through plate armor. The real battlefield effect was broader. Arrows could hit horses, faces, joints, and less protected troops. They could disrupt formations. They could punish anyone moving across open ground, and they could force enemies to bunch up or slow down.
English and Welsh archers were also used with simple field defenses, like sharpened stakes in front of positions, to make cavalry charges riskier. Battles in the Hundred Years' War, like Cressy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415, showed how archers could help decide outcomes when terrain, weather, and leadership lined up. Again, not magic. Archers needed protection, supply, and smart placement. But enemies feared them because you couldn't ignore them. You had to reach them, and reaching them often meant walking through a storm of arrows while your plan fell apart. As the late Middle Ages went on, Europe saw another shift. Infantry with long weapons started beating elite cavalry more often, and that scared a lot of traditional commanders. Number 7. Swiss pikemen. Swiss infantry earned fear and respect because they proved, repeatedly, that disciplined foot soldiers could break forces built around armored cavalry and noble men-at-arms. Their core tool was the pike, a very long spear, often several meters, designed to stop charges and win pushing contests in tight formations. Picture it like a moving wall of sharp points. If you ride into it, you're betting your life that the wall collapses, and it usually didn't. Swiss troops trained to move together in deep blocks, keeping their pikes level and maintaining pressure. They also used halberds, pole weapons with an axe blade and hook, for close fighting once lines collided. Their reputation grew from victories in the 1300s and 1400s, with battles like Morgarten, 1315, and Sempach, 1386, often used to show early Swiss strength, and later Burgundian Wars battles like Grandson and Merton, 1476, and Nancy, 1477, reinforcing the image of unstoppable infantry columns. Swiss tactics weren't only defensive. They could be aggressively offensive, advancing fast in formation to shock an opponent before it settled. That boldness was part of what made them feared. They didn't just hold, they pushed.
European powers started copying or hiring similar pike troops, because once you see a method that can neutralize expensive cavalry, you want it. But not every feared medieval warrior fought in tight blocks. Some were feared because they were hard to pin down at all, fast, harsh, and perfectly suited to rough terrain and raiding warfare.
Number 8. Almogavars. Almogavars were light infantry from the lands of the Crown of Aragon, especially connected with frontier warfare in places like Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia during the long struggle against Muslim states in Iberia. They weren't knights, and they weren't built around heavy armor. They were feared because they moved fast, lived tough, and fought in a style that made heavier troops uncomfortable. Almogavars favored raids, ambushes, and quick clashes rather than slow, set-piece battles. Their gear tended to be practical: light protection, a short spear or lance, javelins, and a tough knife. Instead of relying on armor to absorb hits, they relied on speed, surprise, and the ability to choose ground where horses and heavy formations struggled. They became famous not just in Iberia, but across the Mediterranean, especially with the Catalan Company in the early 1300s, a mercenary force that fought in Byzantine territory and carved out power for itself. Their reputation was sharpened by how mercenary warfare worked. If you were a town or army facing them, you weren't just dealing with soldiers. You were dealing with men whose livelihood depended on winning and taking resources, and that could make them relentless. What made them scary on a tactical level was the mismatch they created. Heavy troops want clear lines, stable fronts, and predictable movement. Light raiders want confusion, broken ground, and sudden pressure on weak points.
As Europe moved into the 1400s, another group became feared for something different again, turning ordinary transport into moving fortifications and blending old weapons with new gunpowder tech in a way enemies weren't ready for.
Number 9. Hussite wagon fighters. In early 15th century Bohemia, the Hussites developed a style of warfare that made heavily armored attackers look outdated in the wrong conditions. Their most famous tool was the wagon fort, often called a Wagenburg. Wagons chained together into a defensive line, reinforced to act like a mobile wall. This wasn't just hide behind wagons. It was a combined arms setup. From behind cover, defenders could use crossbows, early handguns, and small cannons, while infantry with pole weapons guarded gaps and counterattacked when enemies lost momentum. Firearms at the time were slower and less accurate than later guns, but behind a solid barrier, they became much more useful, especially for breaking up charges and adding noise, smoke, and pressure that shook discipline. The Hussites also used weapons adapted from everyday tools, like flails, which were practical in close fighting around tight defenses. Leaders like Jan Žižka are linked to organizing these tactics effectively, and multiple crusading armies sent against the Hussites struggled to achieve decisive victories. That record is what built the fear. You could arrive with noble cavalry, banners, and confidence, and still get stuck in front of a wall that wouldn't break. The wider lesson spread across Europe. Infantry with good planning, solid field fortifications, and ranged fire could beat traditional attacks. Gunpowder was becoming part of mainstream warfare, and states that wanted to survive started investing more in discipline and professional troops. By the late medieval period in southeastern Europe, one infantry force stood out as a symbol of that professional shift: highly trained, tightly organized, and central to a rising empire's success.
Number 10. Ottoman Janissaries. The Janissaries were feared because they represented something many medieval European armies struggled to maintain consistently: a permanent, disciplined infantry corps tied directly to the state. Emerging in the 14th century and growing in influence through the 15th, they became elite troops of the Ottoman Empire, with structured training, regular pay, and strong internal rules. That alone mattered. In medieval warfare, many forces were temporary, raised for a campaign, then sent home. A standing corps could drill, practice formations,
and develop unit habits that made them steadier under pressure. Janissaries fought as infantry who could hold ground, attack at key moments, and support complex operations like sieges. Over time, they used a mix of weapons depending on the period and situation, including bows early on, and later firearms as gunpowder weapons became more reliable. In major campaigns in the Balkans and around the Eastern Mediterranean, European opponents learned that facing them wasn't like facing a random levy. You were up against troops trained to stay in line, follow signals, and keep fighting even when the battlefield got messy. Their role in big, late medieval sieges, especially Constantinople in 1453, also shaped the fear factor, because sieges were where morale collapsed and where professional assault troops made the difference. The broader impact was that neighboring powers increasingly saw disciplined infantry and organized artillery support as the future, not an exception. And that pushed Europe further toward professional armies instead of seasonal forces.